If you're into tourism that's completely off the beaten path and want to go somewhere I guarantee you've never been to and you've probably never heard of because less than 3,000 tourists have ever even been here, come with me to Islas Marías Madre, one of 3 islands in the archipelago just off the coast of Nayarit, Mexico. This is an old penal colony that's now been turned into Mexico's newest tourist destination.
But to me, that's the idea of the islands, that you can turn something bad or sad into something good for you.
That's Maria, one of our guides on the island, and that's a clip from an interview I did with her about Islas Marías and its history. Before I do this full vlog, I want to be clear. I had a really wonderful time on my tour of Islas Marías Madre, but it's important for me to be respectful of its story as a former prison island. And yes, prisoners were here, but that doesn't mean that they were all guilty or that they were all bad people. In fact, there was a wide range of people that were here, from a priest who was wrongfully accused of murder to a famous author, you might know him, Jose Revueltas, because he was held here as a political prisoner as well. He even wrote about the island in one of his books, Los Muros de Agua in 1941, aka Walls of Water, which is based on incidents that occurred during his confinement here.
He rather to write, he rather to be educated, he rather to read. I mean, when he finished the stay here, he had a different life, and he could express that example to the world.
Islas Marías was also, by the way, featured in the 1951 movie Las Islas Marías, and they even used real prisoners for background actors. So now that you have a little bit of history and concept of what I'm talking about, let's go ahead and talk more about my experience of visiting the island. I came to Islas Marías on a press trip with 16 other people who worked in media, and it was genuinely one of the most unique and memorable experiences of my life. Let's start with how you get here. You first have to take a 3-hour ferry from San Blas, Nayarit, and you must stay 3 days and 2 nights. You cannot just come for a day trip. Everything is scheduled for you. Once you arrive, you are going to quickly realize how isolated Islas Marías truly is. It's an island exclusively run by the Mexican Navy, and that means everyone on the island, from tour guides to bartenders, are all Navy. It only opened, by the way, just a couple of months ago at the end of December of 2022. There's only one place to stay on the island. Now, they call it a hostel, but I actually thought it was a lot nicer than a hostel, and there's room for up to 400 people. If you're wondering about the buildings that you're going to be staying in, well, it's actually where families of former prisoners once lived. Yeah, some families were able to actually come along with prisoners on the island. And for the most part, the island itself was an open-air prison where prisoners were forced to work in different types of labor camps, from fishing to shrimping to working the salt flats or even making rope. Now, our tour actually started with a trip to the graveyard where we were told about the unlikely bond between a priest and a murderer who are now buried next to each other right here. Afterwards, we went to an old fort on the island. Here you can also read about the history of the island and see a lot of things that were collected over the years. Now, what's interesting about this old fort is now it's been converted into a museum, telling the story of the island from its founding in the 1500s to becoming a prison in the early 1900s that wasn't decommissioned until 2019. Now, once it was decommissioned, they opened it up for tours at the end of 2022, and now tourists can learn a little something different about a very unique spot in Mexico.
We are here in Isla María Madre. The archipelago is formed by 3 islands and 1 islote. It's like a really small island, which is called San Juanito. This is a place that has only been inhabited by people and like prisoners and other stuff. And this is what we actually are.
The people are the citizens. They deserve to know about history, and they deserve to know all the things we have. So he decided to make something bad or something maybe sad and into something joyful for everybody. So that's the idea.
So then we walked over to some holding cells, which I found a little confusing at first because I just told you guys this was an open-air prison island, but it was then explained that some prisoners who broke rules or stayed out too late would then have to be locked up for a period of time. Afterwards, we walked over to where there were a ton of great souvenirs, but this is an important note if you think about visiting. There is no ATM on the island, and virtually nowhere takes credit cards, so you need to make sure before you get on the ferry that you have all the cash that you want to spend. By the way, if you're wondering kind of about what is included in your trip, it includes transportation, which is the ferry, and some rides around the island, all your food and housing. There is a buffet that they use for breakfast, dinner, and lunch, and there's a couple of different places on the island where you can buy food and snacks, but again, remember, you're going to need to bring cash. However, there's only 1 bar And it does take credit card, but the machine is not always working. So again, better to have cash. The end of our night actually included a tour of the chapel. So I'm kind of fast forwarding here. We ended up eating, and then at nighttime they were like, hey, we have some more tours for you. So we went and toured the chapel. I had kind of snuck away at another time and got some pictures and videos of it in the daytime because it's just so beautiful. They then took us to where prisoners made rope from agave plants. And then they told us a little more on the background of these murals that you're seeing, which were painted by prisoners and tells the story and the history of Islas Marías Madre. Before going to bed, because I did wake up, by the way, at 5 a.m. to start our journey, I stumbled into the screening room, which seemed to be playing a documentary about the island. It was kind of cool to sit there. It was also air conditioned, so that was really nice, and watch some of the old footage and listen to some of the old interviews. So the next day was a full and long day. This was our Saturday, and we woke up at 5 a.m. for a hike to the Cristo Ray. Now, for reference, here's what it looks like from the street. The hike is right around 3,000 meters, and I would guess it's a solid 15% incline. Oh, and I realized I haven't properly introduced you to Fernando and Milton. These are our tour guides. They stayed with us the entire time and gave us all the details of the island, which, by the way, you're not going to find a lot about online. It's not really cataloged anywhere, so hopefully this will be a good reference for you. The hike was a perfect place to watch sunrise, but what was really interesting about this part of the tour at Islas Marías was learning how the prisoners of the island volunteered their time outside of working hours to build the Cristo Ray. It took over 5 years to finish, and the prisoners, by the way, also built this at the second highest peak on the island. The Cristo Ray, by the way, is not finished. You'll notice that below his robes, like essentially from the chest down, are not done, and there are no plans to finish it. So on the hike, something that's really interesting that you'll see is there's this little spot here, and this is where they originally were going to put the Cristo Ray, but the prisoners, in fact, wanted to take it all the way up to the top of the hill, and in doing so, the very top of the statue of the Cristo Ray is right at 3,000 meters above sea level versus being here, which is only about halfway up the hill. Then it was time to check out the governor's mansion, which I came to understand was essentially the warden of the island. The house is currently being refurbished, but you can still see some old stables and pavilions that are around. Afterwards, we went to the only place on the island which they allowed us to actually get in and swim, because apparently there are 27 different types of sharks in these waters, which of course made me want to get in even more, but scuba diving, for the time being, is completely forbidden. But I did see a guy who was from the Navy doing some free diving and spearfishing, so it tells me that there is an opportunity to do some diving or free diving here in the future. This was the longest place that we stayed on the island, by the way. We were here during our tour for about 3 hours. They were like, hey, here's the beach, enjoy the beach. You know, this is kind of your only relaxation time during your 3 days here, because everything else, it's not that it's not relaxing, but it's more, tour focused and history and learning about the island. After the beach, we had lunch, and then we went to the maximum security prison, which of all the places on the island, I can tell you was the place that I immediately felt the most uneasy. You see these really small cells? Well, they were only supposed to have 2 people in them at a time, and at their peak, they had 4+ men who were crammed in here at the time. Now, this part of the prison system on the island was only open for a couple of years and shut down after a riot on the island brought attention to the lack of water and food for the estimated over, I believe they said 8,000 prisoners were here at its peak, not just in the maximum security, but for the entire island. That's both open air camps and lockups, which, as a side note, there was definitely not enough resources or infrastructure for that many people. So this started a domino effect on the island, with the current president, Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador, eventually closing the prison system due to corruption. An example of that is here at the maximum security prison, they were explaining that there are 3 different maximum security, towers, I guess you would call them, but there were supposed to be 4. But essentially, they took the money to have all 4 built, but only built 3. That's kind of an example of the corruption that they saw. Plus, of course, as I just said, there weren't enough resources for the people. And when the riot happened, the way it was explained to me, and I'll give you kind of the abbreviated version of it, the maximum security prisoners were locked up, so they couldn't really riot, but they spent all night screaming. And that essentially told the other prisoners on the island who were in the open air camps, because there's an open air camp very close to the maximum security prison, that they needed help, that they weren't in fair conditions, that they didn't have enough food and water. And so those prisoners in the open air camps kind of spread the word, and that led to a riot. That's essentially the shortened version of what was explained to us. So I figured I'd explain it to you guys too. I'm kind of glad this is where they took us first in the night, because it was really, I don't know, like I said, you walk in and you immediately feel like, it sounds weird to say, like, but bad energy. You feel sadness. You feel the sadness of what happened here. So it's a good thing that it closed, and it's good that they're not shying away from the history. That was another important thing to tell you guys, is during this tour, they weren't trying to be like, oh, this is such a happy place to come and visit now, and it is beautiful now. But I mean, there was a lot of pain and suffering that happened on this island. Okay. So from there, we were bused to the most beautiful part of the island, where I took these shots, one of which you can see a neighboring island. And if you look at the rock formation, it looks like a woman who's laying down. I thought that was really beautiful. On our way back to town, we stopped at the Salt Flats, or where the Salt Flats used to be, and I found the most beautiful doorway I've ever seen. The doorway next to it is actually where Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador, when the president came, that's where he spoke from, but I thought that this doorway was more beautiful, and I want to show you guys. The night ended, we went to the airstrip, and this, by the way, is only used for higher-ups in the government if they decide that they want to come visit. Everyone else must take a ferry. You cannot fly in unless you are, upper government in Mexico. So just be prepared to take that 3-hour ferry and pack that Dramamine. Now, we were told the story of the stars, but the story was in Spanish, and most of our group predominantly spoke English. So I was able to understand a little bit, but I am still learning. But it was a really cool bonding experience and a really great thing to just kind of be laying out. Someone took this picture of us, by the way, just laying out on the airstrip and looking at the stars. Okay, we're gonna get to the next morning. The morning before we left, we woke up at 5 a.m. one last time to do a quick morning hike to the lighthouse on the island, which is also where I caught this video of the most stunning, uninterrupted sunrise. This part of the tour was really interesting. They also showed us this box. I don't even know how to describe it, essentially. What you see now, where you can look inside, that wasn't there. It was a metal box that they used to torture prisoners who were accused of really heinous crimes, and typically individuals who were put in this box did not survive. You can see kind of this pile of rubble, and they told us they weren't really sure what that was. They think it was the old lighthouse keeper's house. Yes, lighthouse keeper's house. But they weren't 100% sure what it was. They don't think it was the old lighthouse, though, even though you can tell this lighthouse is a lot newer and now it's more automated. So we learned a little bit about the lighthouse, as I said. But this was a really cool moment because we took this picture on the steps of the lighthouse, and I handed my phone off to Fernando, one of our guides I told you about. And Fernando then revealed, he handed me back my phone because we were doing our hashtag visit Nayarit, because again, I told you guys I'm on a press trip. And Fernando revealed he's actually an artist, and he hand drew and colored all of these parrots for us, which were native parrots to the island. And he did all of these our trip had 17 people on him. So he drew and then colored in all 17 of these. And I thought it was such a sweet gift. And yeah, essentially I was just taken back because I love art. So when someone gives me art, to me, it's one of the most sweetest and most thoughtful gifts. But in a minute, I'm going to tell you about another gift I got that made me rethink that entire statement. But anyway, so as we were driving by, we were told that women were briefly held on this island as well. And I was able to actually get a peek at the facilities. So I'm walking back right now, and I'm the only journalist who got off the bus to take a tour of where the women prisoners were held. Now, I had a tour guide, Milton, and he showed me around a little bit because now that area has been turned into barracks. Okay, before our final goodbye, Damien, who works as a bartender at the only bar on the island, gifted me the coolest coin. This is a challenge coin, and it's a 200-year anniversary coin of the Mexican Armada. Damien was so sweet with me. He would work on his English and I would work on my Spanish, and we would try and communicate while I was there for the 3 days. And I was so honored that he gifted me such a nice thing. The only thing is I didn't really bring much with me on this trip because I'm gonna be traveling around a lot, but I did bring a jewelry bag because I always bring my jewelry bag because I wear pretty crazy and wild jewelry. So I did have a necklace, and I gave it to Damien, and I told him that it was for his daughter, but then he immediately wrapped it around his wrist, which I thought was really, really sweet, and we took a picture. And essentially that was the end of my trip. The end of our trip, it was just, I don't know, it was kind of emotional. It was because I felt like it was a really interesting and unique experience. I met some really great people. I learned some really important history that I probably would have never even learned. And then I was just grateful that I had the opportunity to kind of do this kind of journalism and share this with you now in a YouTube video.
So the idea is that everybody can come and see a different kind of tourism.
At the end of our journey, we said goodbye. We waved goodbye. Everyone lined up and waved goodbye to us. I took a Dramamine and I woke back up in San Blas. So I hope you enjoyed coming along with me on this journey to Islas Marías Madre. And I hope it gave you a lot of good information if you're considering taking a trip there for yourself as well.
Yeah, well, from the islands, the idea that you can have hope, and that's what can take you farther.